So welcome everybody. My name is Loudon Langley. I told you that. I'll be serving as the hearing officer for today's hearing. I'm joined today by several colleagues from MassDEP. I wanted to introduce Susanna King, the chief of our NPDES section, John Murphy, the chief of our wastewater operator training and certification section, Kevin Brander, section chief of the wastewater program in the Northeast Regional Office, and Deirdre Desmond from our Office of General Counsel. Also, Kathy Baskin, who is our Assistant Commissioner for Bureau of Water Resources. I see Gerard Martin in the audience. He is the Deputy Regional Director for the Bureau of Water Resources at DEP in our Southeast Regional Office. Glad you could make it. There are others not present here from DEP who have worked on this. I wanted to just mention Stephanie Cooper, Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Planning, Janine Simpson for the Director of the Environmental Justice Program at DEP, Carlos Badiola from our Office of General Counsel, and countless others. Wanted to welcome everybody. For the first part of the program tonight, we're going to have just an information session. The intention is to allow people to kind of, hear an explanation of what is contained in the regulations and get some, just sort of our version of what we think is supposed to be in there and what the regs say. We will take clarifying questions that would ask you to hold those at the end of the session, till the end of the session. So with that, we've got some logistics to go over. So Susie, if you could move to the next slide, please, thanks. So as I've said, the information session and public hearing are being recorded. During the information session, we will give a presentation and then have time for clarifying questions and answers to those clarifying questions only. Clarifying questions and answers will conclude by 7 p.m. to start the public hearing. Questions and comments during the information session are not considered public comments on the regulations. So if you want to make a comment that you want to be entered as, an official comment for the public hearing, then you'll need to do that after 7 p.m. Please wait until the end of the presentation to ask your questions. You can type those questions into the chat during the presentation, and then we'll answer them at the end. That'll help you remember them and also help us consider your questions, if we see them in the chat ahead of time. If you want to ask a question orally after the presentation, please use the raise hand feature. And if you're using a phone to dial in, that raise hand is initiated by dialing *9. Please keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. It's at the end of the more logistics. So if you plan to give oral testimony, please type your name and affiliation into the chat now and indicate that you do wish to testify. And Mickey, we've received that in the chat from you, so thank you for that. And if you're participating by phone, we'll ask for any others wanting to give testimony after the questions and answers. So with that and those ground rules, I think we can get started, Susie, and Susie will begin the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Weldon. Here's an outline of the topics that we're going to cover in today's presentation. Mainly, this covers the different sections of the regulation with a few additional topics. So to start out, we're here today to talk about the draft regulations, but these draft regulations came about because of a law that was passed earlier this year. And that is an act promoting awareness of sewage pollution in public waters, which was signed into law in January 2021 and takes effect in July 2022. The statute requires MassDEP to do 3 different things. The first is to promulgate regulations by January 12th, 2022. And of course, that's why we're here today to talk about those proposed regulations. It requires us to post event notifications on our website within 24 hours and provide access to notifications and timely updates. And finally, to publish an annual report each May. So I'm going to go over the different types of events that will require notification, and then I'll talk in a little bit more detail about each of these different types of events. So the first is combined sewer overflows, or CSOs. And there are certain types of sanitary sewer overflows, or SSOs, partially treated wastewater, and finally, blended wastewater. So first, we'll talk a little bit more about CSOs. CSO is any discharge of untreated or partially treated wastewater to a surface water of the Commonwealth from an outfall that is connected to a combined sewer system. So this is the definition that's in the proposed regulations. But to put it a little bit more simply, we have in older communities, the infrastructure is such that you can have a combined system of both stormwater and sewage within the infrastructure for that community. And if you look at the diagram here on the left side during dry weather, the sewage is all going to flow into the POTW, or publicly owned treatment works. But then when you have a wet weather event, that can overwhelm the system, and you have everything being discharged out to the water body. So that discharge consists of a mix of untreated sewage and stormwater. There are some CSO outfalls that have some treatment on them, but many do not have any kind of treatment. So moving into SSOs, or sanitary sewer overflows, that is any overflow, spill, release, discharge, or diversion of untreated or partially treated wastewater from a sanitary sewer system. For example, a break in a sewer main, a pump station failure, or a blockage in a sewage pipe. And this is generally describing all SSOs, not just relevant to these particular regulations. So these regulations require notification for a subset of SSOs. So not all SSOs will require notification under these proposed regulations, but all SSOs do require reporting under a different set of MassDEP regulations, 314 CMR 12, and those are operation and maintenance for wastewater treatment works regulations. So what are the SSOs that do require notification under these regulations? There are 3 different types. The first is any SSO that discharges through a wastewater outfall, either directly or indirectly to a surface water of the Commonwealth. The second is any SSO that flows into a surface water of the Commonwealth and is the result of the sanitary sewer system surcharging under high flow conditions when peak flows cannot be conveyed to a publicly owned treatment works due to capacity constraints. And finally, the third type is any SSO that flows into a surface water of the Commonwealth and is the result of a failure of a wastewater pump station or associated force main designed to convey peak flows of 1 million gallons per day or greater. So digging into the SSOs a little bit more, if we look at 10 years of data for SSOs in the Northeast region of the state, the pie chart here on the left shows the number of SSO events by different causes. And you can see that the greatest percentages are the light green wet weather and the dark green pipe incidents. But when you look at the volume by the different causes of SSOs, you can see that the vast majority, 95%, is due to wet weather. And so the reason we're showing this information is that it demonstrates that a large number or a large volume of the SSOs would fall in the categories that require notification under these regulations. All right, moving on to the next type of event, I'm going to talk a little bit about blending. So first I'll describe kind of generally what blending is and then get into how it's handled in these proposed regulations. So on the left side here, we have a diagram showing how a treatment plant might work during dry weather, where all the flow is going through all parts of the treatment system, including the biological treatment system. And then during wet weather, when you have larger volumes coming into the facility, in order to manage these high flows and push as much flow to the plant for treatment, you may have a portion of the flow diverted around the biological treatments or secondary treatment units, then recombined with the fully treated wastewater and then disinfected before it's discharged out to the water body. And so this describes a blending in general and not specific to these regulations. And then I'll get into how it fits into these regulations. So we developed a specific definition of blended wastewater for the purpose of these proposed regulations, and that is wastewater conveyed to a publicly owned treatment works receiving flows from combined sewer systems, which is in part intentionally diverted around biological or tertiary treatment units during wet weather conditions, and then recombined with flows from the biological or tertiary treatment units as a measure to minimize and mitigate water quality impacts of discharges of combined sewer overflows, in which when released meets or is predicted to meet NIPD's and surface water discharge permit effluent limits based on historic information provided by the permittee through its CSO public notification plan. So the underlined portion here is because this is key to the regulations here. The general definition of blending would not require that it meets or is predicted to meet permit limits, but we're making that a specific requirement here in order to trigger a different type of notification for these type of events. And this needs to be approved through a CSO public notification plan, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so we went through all the different types of events, and now I'll go through the public advisory notification requirements. And these are the requirements that are going to apply to most of the types of discharges. So CSOs, SSOs, and partially treated wastewater. Requires notice within 2 hours of discovery of the event. And the notification must be posted on the permittee's website. And then it must be sent out to state, federal, and local agencies, news organizations, individuals subscribed to receive, and individuals subscribed to receive notifications by email or text. There's quite a long list of the different agencies that need to be notified, so I haven't included the full list here, but you can find it in the draft regulation. And there is very specific information needs to be included in notification, and I'll go over that in the next slide. And then just wanted to also state that the regulation proposes a definition of discovery for each type of event, and that is because the timing is built off the time of discovery, and so we wanted to make that clear within the regulations. Okay, so these are the items that have to be included in the public advisory notification from the permittee: the location of the discharge or overflow, the date, time, duration of the discharge or overflow, estimated volume based on data from the prior 3 years, the identity of the permittee, whether the discharge or overflow has ceased, description of treatment, if any, waters and land areas potentially affected, precautionary measures to be taken by the public, a link to the permittee's website, and then finally a statement that the discharge or overflow consists of or likely consists of untreated or partially treated sewage and waste. So then there is a different set of requirements for anything that can meet this definition of blended wastewater. So this would apply to releases of blended wastewater that are predicted to meet numeric effluent permit limits only. So if they are not predicted to meet effluent limits, they're then considered partially treated, and that would require the full public advisory notification that I just described. A permittee needs to have approval from MassDEP through its CSO public notification plan in order to be able to issue blended wastewater notifications instead of the public advisory notification. If they are approved to do that, the notice is within 2 hours, the same as the public advisory notification, and it is a notification just on the permittee's website. The notice has to include the location, date, time, and duration, as well as a description of the treatment, and a statement explaining that blended wastewater is predicted to meet NIPD's and surface water discharge permit effluent limits, which are established to protect public health. Okay, so then just a little bit about the requirements for website and signage for the CSO permittees. So the website for each permittee needs to, sorry about that. Each permittee needs to have a map of their outfalls, a summary describing a summary and status of their long-term control plan, and links to any previously completed CSO reports. Need to have instructions for subscribing to their notifications. And then if they are approved to issue blended wastewater notifications, then these notifications would go on the website as well. For signage for CSOs, the regulations require at least one permanent sign for each outfall. And there is specific content that needs to be included on the signs, which is specified in both the statute and the regulation. The number of signs and the locations for each outfall will be determined through the CSO public notification plan, with the understanding that each permittee and each of their outfalls is different. And there may be special situations that apply to each rather than a one size fits all approach for the requirements for signs. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Leldon to pick it up with CSO public notification plans.
All right, thank you, Susie. So it's become evident, over the course of the conversations we've had over the last several months with different people that each of the CSO outfalls is, a little different, a little unique. The way that permittees detect activation and measure the volume being discharged are all somewhat, unique to specific outfalls. And so we were hoping to create a mechanism by which the permittee could describe each of its outfalls and explain, what each of them, how each of them functioned, and that would inform some of the decision making that needs to be done to implement the statute. For example, there is a bias in the statute for metering. It requires that outfalls be metered unless an alternative method of measuring the flow is and the activation is authorized by DEP. So we want people to have a chance to, explain how they were detecting activation and measuring flow. So we're going to just run through some of the details of the CSO notification plans that are described in the regs. It would be required for all CSO permittees, and it does require MassDEP approval. So there's a need for us to be able to review all of these plans and grant those authorizations. We've proposed that it would be due to MassDEP by February 1st of 2022. And then one of the reasons that we're holding this info session, at this time is so that folks can get started on developing a CSO notification plan specific to their own system. There is a 30-day public comment period that commences after publication in the Environmental Monitor. And that would allow, the public to comment and the department to see those comments as well as the permittee. Each of the notification plans should describe the method of detecting the discharges and estimating the volume of those discharges, and that it would provide historic data to obtain approval for blended wastewater notifications if a facility, practices blending of wastewater. So we are anticipating that people would be able to match up those blending events that may have occurred in the past, along with the effluent data that they would have obtained from during those blending events, and be able to predict which of them would meet the permit effluent limits, and essentially create some operating guidelines for those that will meet the are likely to meet the permit effluent limits and be classified as blending wastewater versus those that would not be able to. And as Susie noted before, the substance of that is that we've proposed that there are different types of notification procedures depending upon whether the discharge meets the definition of partially treated or whether it meets the definition of blended wastewater. The notification plan should also include information about the website, signage, and measures to communicate to EJ populations within that community. Next slide, please. So continuing with CSO public notification plan requirements, the purpose is to establish efficient, timely, and a reliable program for determining when each outfall is discharging, estimating the commencement and cessation times of the discharge, since these are requirements of the statute that people are reporting those, and estimating the volume and duration of each of those discharges. They would have to use meter and telemetry equipment unless MassDEP approves an alternative method. And so we would envision that the notification plan would make that request to use another method for any outfalls where that was desired, and incorporate that into the plan. And then specific provisions are required if modeling is proposed. And so you should consult the regulations with those particular provisions related to modeling. It's also occurred to us since then that inclusion of any waiver request for CSO outfalls that may have been decommissioned, you may also want to send those to DEP at the same time, along with your CSO notification plan. We'll talk in a moment about the waivers that can be requested. Next slide, please. So for the notification plans for blended wastewater, I've touched on some of this. We anticipate that permittees that do practice blending would have SOPs in place, standard operating procedures in place for releasing blended wastewater and providing historic effluent data from those blending events, that they could, coordinate those data and present that in their plan for us to make a decision on. The plan must demonstrate that blending only occurs during wet weather events or is allowed by a NPDES or surface water discharge permit, that flow diverted around the biological or tertiary treatment must receive primary clarification, solids and floatables disposal and disinfection. So we'd want certification of that. And that effluent meets or is predicted to meet NPDES and surface water discharge permit effluent limits during blending events based on historic data, so that we can authorize those blending events through our notification plan approval. Next slide, please. So the permittee does have reporting requirements. The statute requires MassDEP to develop a website, and so MassDEP has been working on a data system that we would post to that website that would be able to receive information. And we have secured funding for that. We've been working with our IT department. We're sort of moving up to the next level of data system development now. And the data system would need to be in place by July of 2022, so that the statute can be fully implemented through the reporting that is required of permittees. So we're working towards that goal. It's likely that we will have more information to share with you at a later time on the data system, be able to talk to you a bit more about its functionality and things of that kind. But we would set that up for a later point in time, as it's not well developed enough for us to really share much in the way of detail about it. Permittee must do that reporting to MassDEP within 2 hours of discovery of the event. And that we also recognize that it is extremely difficult for permittees to, to predict the volume of the flow when a CSO discharge is occurring. So we've set up the opportunity for discharges and overflows from the prior month to be reported on the 15th of the following month, for the purpose of updating the data, the duration and volume of the discharge since the public advisory notification went out, the rainfall data associated with the storm event in which the discharge occurred, and treatment, if any, that was provided. We also, one of the reasons that we've selected the 15th of each month is that we understand that that coincides with the reporting that needs to be done to EPA. So we were doing that, selecting that date for the purpose of trying to make it administratively easier for permittees to report. We also are requesting that annual updates or corrections be made to the plans by February 1st of each year. That would give us an opportunity to, review those updates or corrections, decommissioning that might have occurred, modifications to the detection, the metering or other methods of detection activations, detecting activations. So those events would, those updates rather, or corrections would occur at February 1st of each year. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned before, waivers, the statute gives the permittees the ability to request a waiver from any of the requirements of the regulation if an outfall has been is decommissioned or there has not been a significant discharge from the outfall during the preceding 5 years. So we would expect some detail explaining, the decommissioning of that particular outfall. And of course, if outfalls were decommissioned after the submittal of the initial CSO notification plan, then you could provide those decommissioning details at the update on February 1st of the following year. All waivers are subject to MassDEP approval. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're moving into a section of the statute that is specific to work that would, or warnings that would be issued by the Board of Health or the Health Department in the municipality. The Board of Health or Health Department must issue the public health warning. We have consulted with Massachusetts Department of Public Health, which was required of us by the statute. And it's through those consultations that the regulations are proposing that the public health warning would be issued every time that there was notification of an event by a permittee, excluding the blended wastewater notifications. So any public advisory notification issued by a permittee, except for those blended wastewater notifications, would trigger a public health warning. The Board of Health would use the existing emergency notification system, including reverse 911 if that's available. And public health warnings would include the location, date, and time of the discharge or overflow, and a recommendation to avoid contact with water for 48 hours because of the potential risk to public health. Next slide, please. So additional information on public health warnings. The Board of Health or Health Department must post or cause to be posted temporary signage in conspicuous locations affording access to water bodies. This was a provision that was that came about as a result of our consultation with DPH. We do recognize that imposes some burden on boards of health. We have been in conversation with boards of health about some ways to relieve that burden, but we've also identified this in our notice to reviewers that was issued at the time of our public notice, that this was a particular area of substance that MassDEP was inviting public comment on. For the public health warnings, the signage, the temporary signs must include the following: warning, avoid contact with water, may cause illness. It would also include infographics that depicted no fishing, boating, or swimming. The reason for the warning is to inform the public about untreated or partially treated sewage and surface waters and provide the Board of Health or Health Department contact information. There's been some discussion over boards that felt that some of these responsibilities would more appropriately reside with the permittees. So I'll just point out the must post or cause to be posted temporary signage. So if there was an arrangement made between a permittee and a Board of Health about posting of temporary signage, that could still meet the intent of the act and the language in the regulations. Next slide, please. So these regulations are some of the first, I think, of DEP regulations that have, are attempting to really incorporate a more robust component of environmental justice components. And, I think that you will see additional environmental justice issues and components included in subsequent MassDEP regulations. We recognize that this is an area that is new to all of you. It's certainly new to us. We've made some concerted efforts to try and conform to the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs EJ policy. That policy was first issued in 2017, and has recently been updated. And we're also aware that Title VI of federal law does also apply here for facilities that receive federal funding. So we do believe that there are EJ components that need to be complied with, and these regs are trying to detail those so that people would have, you know, a solid chance of reaching those communities and improving the awareness of the discharges of CSOs and SSOs subject to these regs within the those EJ populations. So the permittee is required to contact news organizations that serve EJ populations when they are posting the public advisory notifications, and language translation is required as appropriate for these mechanisms within the regs: the public advisory notifications issued by the permittee, the permanent warning signs located at outfalls, which is also a requirement of permittees, the public notice of the CSO public notification plan that is submitted by permittees, and the public health warnings and temporary signs at access points. Both of those responsibilities, as I've mentioned, fall with the boards of health. The media outlet that serves the EJ population for public notice of the CSO public notification plan should be identified and contacted as well. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this note to reviewers. MassDEP is seeking your comment specifically on the topic of blended wastewater. We got very robust comments about blended wastewater at the public hearing that we held this afternoon. We are interested in your comments about potential additional information to include on the permittees' websites about blended wastewater. And we're also interested in your comments about public health warnings and temporary signage. As I've mentioned, these happen to pose some responsibilities on boards of health, and we're interested particularly from boards in how those might affect them and their ability to administrate those requirements. Next slide, please. If you wish to provide oral testimony at today's hearing, you may do so. Please indicate your intention in the chat with your name and affiliation and your intention to testify. If you wish to submit written comments, I strongly encourage you to send your written comments to this email address, massdep.npdes@mass.gov. This will facilitate us receiving and reviewing your comments in a timely manner and being able to use them to make revisions to our regs. As probably many of you are still working remotely or working in hybrid circumstances due to COVID-19. So it's much easier for us to access those electronic comments than it is for us to access the hard copy comments that may come in through, through the U.S. Postal Service. If you do need to submit your comments in hard copy format, then please mail them to this address: attention sewage notification, MassDEP, 1 Winter Street, 5th floor, Boston, Mass. 02108. And as a reminder, the public comment period ends at 5 p.m. on November 8th. And we certainly appreciate any comments that we receive to help us, develop a better set of regs. Next slide, please. At this point, we're going to pause and take clarifying questions, listing here a couple of the contacts on this. If you do need to reach out to us, please feel free to contact me. There's my email address, leldon.langley@mass.gov, and Susie can be reached at susanna.king@mass.gov.
I have a question.
Okay, Susie, could you just switch us over to where we can see the folks? And if anybody is able to, if folks want to turn on their cameras, it would probably make the conversation go easier if you're able. And I believe, was that Mickey who was asking?
Yes,
to
it was.
ask
It
a
was
question?
Mickey Nowak.
Hi, Mickey.
Mickey Nowak from Mass Water Environment Association. Let me see if I can get my camera on. So my question is, there are 19 CSO communities. And so the other treatment facilities are non-CSO communities. So, but they could be subject to the SSO reporting requirements. Are those facilities, the non-CSO facilities, required to have their own website to post to the public advisories?
It is that that everyone is required to have a website on which they post public advisory notifications. But the CSO notification plans applies specifically only to those CSO communities. Anyone else on the team here want to comment or add to that?
Yeah,
Susan?
I agree with you, Weldon. Everybody needs to be able to post the notifications to their website. There are just some more specific requirements for the website for CSO permittees that we covered early on, but website is one of the required forms of notification for all of the different types of covered events.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I want to comment on it further, but I'm going to save that for the 7 p.m. portion. I don't think it's for this portion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mickey. Any other comments or clarifying questions, I should say?
Hi, this is Kevin McCarthy with Groundwork Lawrence.
Hi, Kevin.
How are you? I do have a question on the same topic, and it had occurred to me that, and indeed, if there are 19 CSO communities, that seems a little the notification process would be a little fragmented for members of the public. So, for example, where we are in the Merrimack Valley, we have upriver neighbors in New Hampshire who I'm not sure are reporting, but our upriver neighbors in, say, in the town of, say, Salisbury, would include several communities upriver. So a resident of say Newburyport or Salisbury would have to subscribe to the notifications for all of the CSO communities upstream from the Merrimack River. And so it strikes me as perhaps a little, I guess the open question, is there a better way to do it that might include, say, direct reporting to a portal on DEP's website, where I could subscribe once for my area and be notified if there was any of those communities? I don't know what the best answer is, and you know, websites also at the risk of pushing out the technology barriers. I know websites they're not always updated, and it's not always the best way to set out alerts. Email alerts aren't always the greatest, even though many of the communities on the Merrimack are using them. It'd be great to have something more immediate, and I know that's probably something you've considered, but I'd throw that just as an observation as much as a question. Thank you.
Okay. Team members, anybody want to take that or?
Well, I'll start, Weldon, but others can fill in. To some extent, I think everyone needs to keep in mind the parameters of the law that was enacted, and that sets up a structure that has the permittees carrying out a subscriber-based system. So where our regulations had to be drafted in a compliance and basically consistent with those requirements. As Leldon said, we're in the process of developing an IT program where we're going to get reports also. And, that's still under development. But I think what we're trying to be mindful of is some of the comments we're receiving. The goal certainly is to try to make this information timely to the interested parties and efficient. So, but we still have to live within the parameters of what the law required.
And I thank you, Kevin. And I would just add as well that the statute talks about the notification going to municipalities that are affected by the discharge. And so it gets to your point a bit, yeah, Kevin. And I would just identify that as a portion of the statute you might want to go back and consult to see, to see how that was placed in the statute. I think that we here at DEP also have some questions ourselves about how easy it is for one to predict those communities that would be affected by the discharge, and what exactly does that mean, affected to a significant degree, to a degree that affects public health. What exactly does that mean? But I would point you to that provision of the statute. Okay. Any other clarifying questions that we can take now?
There's no questions in the chat.
Okay, anybody want to raise their hand if they have a question? And if not, we may just take a short break and let folks catch their breath before we start the public hearing. We can't really start the public hearing until 7 o'clock, since I think that was the time we placed in our notification.
Well, then we have 2 people signed up to testify in the chat. So if anyone else is looking to testify, please enter your name and association in the chat now, please.
Well, then we had a slide with public hearing logistics. So maybe we should go over those before we do the break. So I can reshare.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to wait until we?
Yeah, I think we might as well wait, because we might get more people joining at 7, people who might not have, might be, on their commute home or doing childcare or whatever they needed to do, and hoping to have additional people join at 7 o'clock. Seeing someone saying that their train is delayed, so I don't miss the train delays. That's part of working from home. I don't miss. All right. Well, we'll let folks, take 5, catch your breath, and then we will return at 7 p.m. to begin the public hearing. Thank you.